Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, in whom I am present and lowly among you, but being absent and bold towards you. But I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold with that confidence, but which I intend to be bold against some who think of us as we walked according to the flesh. Here's Paul. You know, they were talking about him. And they were talking about him, you know, when he's in their presence, they say, he says, first he starts out, he says, Paul, myself, I plead with you meekness and gentleness in Christ. He says that meekness and gentleness in Christ, he starts right off with that. Because he wants to be nice to him. He wants to be gentle. But then he says, in who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am I bold towards you. You know, Paul was, when he was with the people, and this is something I didn't know about him, he was actually meek when he was with the people. He wasn't really, he didn't run them over. He was really kind and generous with them when he was there. But when he wrote his letters, he came across really strong. And they're like, man, you know, when you're with us, you were really weak. But now that you're absent from us, you're really telling us, aren't you? So here's Paul. One thing he is good at, he is good writing letters. But in person, he's actually a small guy in stature. He's not big. He's very meek and mild. And I always thought of Paul being, you know, straightforward and bold. But then he says here in verse 2, he says, but I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some who think of us as we walk according to the flesh. So he's saying when he's coming, he was one of those guys. He was nice, but if he had to do something, he wasn't afraid to do it. He's willing to be bold, but he wasn't out there to run people over. He wasn't there to destroy people. He was there to do his job. And these people, what was going on is, if you get to the next couple chapters, they were coming in and redoctrinating all the people in the church. And they were taking people from the church, you'll find out as you go down through here. So he's coming back, and he says, I want this straightened out before I come back, so I don't have to address it. Because he says, if I address it, I'm going to have to be bold, and I'm going to have to be confident and go towards you. Because he said in verse 3, he says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of God, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. You know, Paul was here. What's our first thing we're supposed to do when we're in warfare, spiritual warfare? Is pray. But what do most people do? Well, nothing else is good working, so let's pray. We don't use what the real armor is, do we?
No.
We all wait until we see. We wait, try doing it on our own. Then we look at God. We're supposed to be, our warfare isn't against men. It's against the Spirit. So what do we use? our regular things we use, like our strength in that, is it any good?
No, not.
We have to use the armor of God. We have to be using prayer. We have to be using our knowledge of God. And that's what he's bringing. He's saying, we have to be obedience of Christ. We have to do what he did. We're not fighting a normal fight. And he's saying to them, now listen to what I'm saying. This is what you need to do first, is start praying and doing what you're supposed to do in the Lord first. You're not going to win by doing the bodily things. Like a lot of them were coming in were from the Jewish synagogues and they were telling them to do the laws. Is that how you get saved?
No.
It's by grace. And that's what they're doing. And in verse 7 he says, do you look at things according to the outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so we're Christ. For even if I should be boasting somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us, for edification, not for destruction, I shall not be ashamed. Here's Paul. He's talking about appearance. Well, he probably was a short little Jew guy. And he really wouldn't intimidate you. When they talk about appearance, he wasn't the best speaker. He wasn't very charismatic. These are things we know about him. So, he's not saying, God don't use the best things, does he, all the time? God uses the lowly stuff to show us who he really is. He's using Paul to do this. And, he says, I should not boast somewhat more about our authorities. It's not his authority he's boasting about. He's boasting about the Lord gave him edification and not for destruction. I should not be ashamed. Least I seem to terrify you by letters. He was scared by the letters he was writing, wasn't he? These guys, because he was so straightforward with the letters he was writing to these guys, because of the problems, they couldn't believe the stuff he was writing. Because when he's in person, he was so nice. But when he's writing, he was straightforward. He told them what the problems were. He told them they needed fixed. And this is what he did. Because he wasn't, like I said, he wasn't one of the best speakers. He wasn't one of the ones but he got his point across. And God used him. And then he says in verse 10, for this letter, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. Let such a person consider this, that what we are in the world, by letters, when we are absent, such we will also be in deeds when we are present. For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who command themselves, but they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves among themselves, are not wise. So he's saying, his letters and that, when he's there, when he's absent, he's really straightforward. But he also backs stuff up with his deeds. He always does what he's supposed to be doing, don't he? This is one of the things Paul realized where his weaknesses was and where his strengths were. We need to realize that too. When we're in the church, when you're in leadership in that, you have to realize, do all of us have all the gifts? We don't. So we have to realize where our strengths and weaknesses are. Paul knew, and he was willing to use others to do that stuff for him. And we need to do the same thing. What happens with a lot of leadership? They get pride, don't they? And they think they can do it all. None of us can. We all have different gifts. We all have stuff. And we have to realize we are weak in some areas. And some people are really strong. Because it says in the Bible, sometimes our strength becomes our weakness. Because when we think of our strength, we start relying on it too much. And our weaknesses become our strengths. So when we realize where our problems are, if we work on them, God's going to help us through them. But that means also we're supposed to use others that have them strengths. We're not supposed to do it all ourselves. We're a one body. We're a body of Christ. And everybody's just important to somebody else. But then he goes on, we however will not boast beyond measures, but with the limits of the spheres which God appointed us. A sphere which especially includes, for we are not overextending ourselves, as though our authority did not extend to you. For it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ, not boasting in things beyond measures, that is in other man's labor, but having hope that in our faith is increased and we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere. They didn't come here overextending what they could do. They knew what they could do. They knew what the Spirit of God was. And he appointed them to come here and preach the gospel, didn't he? That's where he put them at. But then they started on this. They said they're not boasting in things beyond measures or in other man's labors. Have you ever noticed in some churches, what do? They come and they take people from other churches. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to go out and reach the unsaved. If we have to go other places where there's Christian churches, and we know they're Christian churches, and they're following the Word, and we're taking their members, are we actually doing what we're supposed to be doing?
No.
That's what these guys were doing. They were coming into Paul's church that he established. And these guys were starting their own churches. Because he says, not boasting in things beyond measures, verse 16, in others man labor, but having hope, that in your faith increasing we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our own sphere. And then he goes on to preaching the gospel in regions beyond you, and not to boast in any other man's sphere to accomplish. But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commands himself is approved, but whom the Lord commands. His sphere, he kept enlarging it, didn't he? He kept going out and preaching in different areas. He's going out to preach the gospel in regions beyond you. If we just look at our area, how many other areas is there preached in just where we reach? There's a lot of people just in Halsdale area that's never heard about Christ. I've had teens come that never been to a vacation Bible school, never been to church. So that's telling me their parents have never been to church, doesn't it? Yeah. There's so much area just in this small town. If we reach the people, man, you could really grow a church. And we have to realize that's not taking people from other churches either. That's by going out and reaching the unsaved. And Paul's telling us that. We're supposed to go out and, we're supposed to go out and make our spirit bigger, aren't we? If we're not doing that, are we actually doing the work? You know, it's easy to go in churches and take members that are already there and they're doing stuff. But that's not what God's will is for anybody. God's will is that we go out and get others that aren't saved. Bring them in, disciple them, and make them into disciples. And that's what we're supposed to do. And Paul, he's telling these guys, you know, these guys are coming in, stealing members from the church. They're leading them the wrong way. And he's telling them, you know, go out and start your own church. Go out and do what you're supposed to be doing. And this is where he's going to keep going on in the next couple of chapters about this stuff too. It's going wrong. And we'll be reading that here later on. So let's go to prayer.